contrary to the position of Vladimir Putin. And I believe Vladimir Putin, who doesn't frankly appear to give a darn about the tens of thousands of dead Russians, as long as he can retain his autocratic grip on power, and he believes that this administration in Washington is looking for the exits. And Ukraine, frankly, is experiencing a manpower shortage and is under some pressure. And I think Putin sees an opportunity here to deceive Americans and deceive this administration into believing that Ukraine is the problem. And if you look at the national security strategy that was issued today, for those who don't follow these things full time, this is a big deal. This is a once in administration type thing that is published pursuant to the law, where an administration says, here's what we think is going on in the world, here are our core interests, here are the threats to those interests, and here's what we're going to do about it across all domains of power. That's what an ideal national security strategy says. And in this one, if you just landed from Mars and you read the part of the national...
Listen to me and listen carefully, because what you just heard is not an accident, and it is not a one-off diplomatic observation from some talking head spitting analysis into the void. What you just heard is the sound of American democracy being systematically dismantled by an administration that cannot even identify its enemies because it has become one, an administration that just released a national security strategy document that reads less like a blueprint for America's strength and more like a love letter to the Kremlin wrapped in the language of cultural grievance and isolationist fever dreams. And you need to understand something right now before we go any further, because the implications here are so staggering that they threaten to collapse the entire post-World War II international order that has kept us safe for 8 decades. The Kremlin has praised a new national security strategy adopted by U.S. President Donald Trump, saying it aligns closely with Russia's own view of global affairs. Did you catch that? Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said on Sunday that the changes correspond in many ways to our vision. When the Kremlin is celebrating your national security strategy, you have already lost before you even began. And this expert in the clip you just heard understands what so many Americans still refuse to see, that the U.S. document published last week warns that Europe faces what it calls civilizational erasure, identifies ending the war in Ukraine as a core U.S. interest, and signals a shift towards restoring what Washington describes as strategic stability with Moscow. Let that sentence marinate in your consciousness for just a moment, because we are watching in real time as the Trump administration blames European culture for the crisis in Ukraine, instead of naming the dictator who launched an unprovoked war of conquest that has killed over 1 million people. When you count both sides of this nightmare, and I want you to understand the historical weight of what we are witnessing, because this is not some minor recalibration of priorities or a reasonable reassessment of American interests abroad. This is a fundamental betrayal of everything the United States has stood for since the defeat of fascism in 1945, and the security expert you heard is absolutely right to be alarmed, because verified Russian military deaths in Ukraine have risen to at least 1,542 since the full-scale invasions, with Wyvil 5 twice. British intelligence in June putting total Russian casualties at about 1 million, including up to 250,000 killed, and Putin does not care. He genuinely does not give a single solitary damn about the tens of thousands of young Russian men being fed into the meat grinder of his imperial ambitions, long as he can maintain his autocratic grip on power and expand his territory. And wait for it, because here comes the bombshell that should make your blood run cold. Trump's 28-point peace plan demands that Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, and Kherson and Zaporizhia will be frozen along the line of contact, which means de facto recognition of Russian territorial conquest. This is not diplomacy, this is capitulation dressed up as deal-making, and the Trump administration's 28-point plan for peace in Ukraine that leaked this week does not create a path out of the war. It merely repackages the Kremlin's long-standing demands and presents them as diplomatic breakthrough. You want to know what makes this even more grotesque? Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev told Axios he is optimistic about the Trump plan because, unlike past efforts, we feel the Russian position is really being heard. Of course, the Russian position is being heard because the Trump administration is literally writing Moscow's wish list into American foreign policy documents and calling it peace, and the national security strategy that dropped last week confirms every single fear that serious people have had about this administration's willingness to abandon our allies and embrace authoritarians, because when you read that document, what you find is not a serious assessment of threats, but rather, Trump's national security strategy published in the dead of night early Friday launched an all-out attack, lambasting Europe as an over-regulated, censorious continent lacking in self-confidence and facing civilizational erasure due to immigration. Let me be exceptionally clear about what is happening here, because the framing matters tremendously, and the expert in that clip grasps this with perfect clarity. The The strategy directs stronger language at longtime U.S. allies in Europe than Russia, which had been called out in the first Trump administration as a chief geopolitical rival. Think about that architecture of blame for 1 second. Because Putin invades a sovereign democracy, murders hundreds of thousands of people, commits systematic war crimes, displaces millions and terrorizes an entire nation, and Trump's response is to publish a national security document that describes the core problem of the European continent as a neglect of Western values understood as nationalist conservative values and a loss of national identities due to immigration and cratering birth rates, with the alleged result being economic stagnation, military weakness, and civilizational erasure of Europe. This is Viktor Orban's propaganda. This is Marine Le Pen's fever dream. This is the intellectual architecture of ethno-nationalism being elevated to the level of official American strategic doctrine, and it tells you everything you need to know about who this administration serves and what worldview animates their understanding of global affairs. The security hawk in that clip says Putin is trying to deceive Americans into believing Ukraine is the problem, and he is absolutely correct, because that is precisely the information operation that Moscow has been running for years, and it has found its most receptive audience not in the streets of America, but in the highest levels of the American government itself. And you need to understand how this deception works, because it is sophisticated in its cynicism, even as it relies on the crudest appeals to isolationism and cultural panic. Under Trump, Washington's approach to the conflict has shifted amid public clashes with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump has previously described Russian President Vladimir Putin as a friend. Meanwhile, Zelensky has repeatedly sought strong backing from European partners, especially when U.S. officials have endorsed Moscow's position that Kyiv should consider territorial concessions under any peace agreement. This is not normal diplomacy. This is an American administration openly siding with an aggressive authoritarian power against a democratic ally that is fighting for its survival, and the MAGA right has completely bought into this framework, hook, line, and sinker, because only 5% of Republicans support Russia over Ukraine, but the MAGA wing of the GOP has continually sided with Putin and against Ukraine. We have documented evidence of this intellectual rot spreading through the Republican Party like a malignancy, and it matters because these are the people who control Congress. These are the people who set the terms of debate. All signs point to this right-wing Republican affection for Vladimir Putin as one of the primary reasons Ukraine is being singled out for opposition, while the same Republicans who claim to oppose foreign interventionism are often the loudest voices clamoring for confrontational policies toward China, which tells you this is not about principle, this is about something deeper and more disturbing. Senator Chris Murphy put it with devastating precision when he observed that the hot new thinkers on the right aren't really for democracy any longer. The new right thinks that democracy has outlived its usefulness and needs to be destroyed and replaced by something else, like a quasi-monarchy or a CEO-style government, and the conservative movement today is awash with proponents of doing away with participatory democracy, and so it's really no secret that there is a growing affection for the most prominent dictator in the world. This is the ideological through-line that connects Trump's praise for Putin to the MAGA movement's hostility toward Ukraine, to the national security strategy that treats Europe's commitment to liberal democracy as a civilizational problem rather than a civilizational achievement. And when you understand this connection, you realize we are not dealing with a foreign policy disagreement. We are dealing with a fundamental assault on the philosophical foundations of democratic governance itself. The expert in the clip mentions something crucial that deserves much deeper examination because it reveals the entire game. He says that if you just landed from Mars and read the part of the national security strategy about Ukraine and Russia, you would have no idea who the aggressor is, and that is by design. That is the entire point, because the Trump national security strategy states it is a core interest of the United States to negotiate an expeditious cessation of hostilities in Ukraine in order to stabilize European economies, prevent unintended escalation or expansion of the war, and re-establish strategic stability with Russia. Notice what is absent from that formulation. There is no mention of Russian aggression. There is no acknowledgement of Ukrainian sovereignty. There is no moral clarity about who started this war and why. This NSS is a real, painful, shocking wake-up call for Europe. It is a moment of cavernous divergence between Europe's view of itself and Trump's vision for Europe. And if Europe had any doubt that the Trump administration is fully committed to a tough love strategy, it now knows for sure. But here is where it gets even more sinister, and I need you to track with me, because the levels of betrayal here are so profound that they demand we examine every dimension. Former Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk called the plan a creeping capitulation, because it locks in Russia's territorial gains, cedes additional unoccupied territory in the Donbas, prohibits NATO membership by legal statute, and strips Ukraine of the long-range strike capabilities it needs to blunt another offensive. And what does such a deal guarantee? Such a deal guarantees only one outcome: a future attack by Moscow where it can truly finish the job. This is not peace. This is an interregnum. This is giving Putin time to regroup and rearm and prepare for the next phase of conquest. And the Trump administration either does not understand this basic strategic reality or does not care, and I am increasingly convinced it is the latter, because the pattern is too consistent, the deference too pronounced, the excuses too readily available. Look at who Trump sent to negotiate with Putin, because the personnel choices tell you everything about the administration's priorities and seriousness. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with Russian President Vladimir Putin, the two men working to get the Russian leader who started the war by invading his neighbor to agree to end it. Jared Kushner, who has no diplomatic experience, no expertise in European security, no background in Russian affairs, and Steve Witkoff, a real estate developer, warm relationship with Moscow, has stirred concern among some allies, particularly given Witkoff's history of engaging with top Russian officials without the presence of experienced diplomats or even at times U.S. note-takers. This is amateur hour elevated to the level of grand strategy. This is Trump treating the future of European security like a real estate transaction, where you split the difference and shake hands and move on to the next deal. Except this is not a casino in Atlantic City. This is the question of whether democracy can survive against autocratic aggression in the 21st century. And the Russian casualties keep mounting because as of December 7, 2025, Ukraine reports over 1.18 million Russian military losses since the full-scale invasion, with British intelligence confirming rising daily casualties in 2025, and according to an analysis published by The Economist on October 17, 2025, based on data from satellites and more than 200 credible estimates of casualties from Western governments and independent researchers, Russia's total casualty toll had increased by 60% since the start of the year, with over 100,000 soldiers reportedly killed since the beginning of 2025, and Putin just keeps sending more young men into the meat grinder because he believes, and this is the critical point, he believes this administration is looking for the exits. He believes he can outlast American attention and European resolve, and the horrifying thing is, he might be right, because Trump's peace plan essentially gives him everything he wants while demanding Ukraine surrender territory. It still controls and accept permanent limitations on its military, and forego NATO membership, which is the only real security guarantee that could prevent another Russian invasion in 5 or 10 years. The MAGA right will tell you this is realism. They will say we cannot afford to keep funding Ukraine forever. They will argue that American interests lie elsewhere and we should not be the world's policeman, but the cost of helping Ukraine fight off Russia's brutal invasion amounts to less than 5% of the U.S. defense budget. Much of that money goes back to U.S. companies to replenish stocks of old weapons that were sitting idle anyway. Weakening the Russian military makes Europe safer, and China is watching to see whether the West has the stomach to defend democracies from aggression. These are not abstractions, these are strategic realities, and the failure to grasp them or the willful refusal to acknowledge them represents either catastrophic ignorance or something far more troubling, which is alignment with autocratic interests against democratic ones. Let me take you back to that clip one more time, because the expert makes a point that needs to be amplified and repeated until it penetrates the consciousness of every single American who cares about our role in the world. He says Putin is trying to deceive Americans into believing Ukraine is the problem, when in fact Russia is waging an unprovoked war of brutal conquest, and the Trump administration just published a national security strategy that essentially adopts the Russian framing of this conflict, treating Ukraine as a burden rather than a democratic ally fighting for its survival, treating Europe's liberal values as weakness rather than strength, treating Putin's imperialism as a legitimate security concern rather than naked aggression. And you have to ask yourself, how did we get here? How did we arrive at a moment where an American president would publish a document that the Kremlin welcomed because it includes language about ending the perception of the NATO military alliance as a perpetually expanding alliance, which has been Moscow's talking point for 2 decades, even though NATO expansion has always been driven by the democratic choices of sovereign nations seeking protection from Russian aggression? The answer is complex, but it runs through decades of Trump's financial entanglements with Russian post-Soviet money. It runs through his inexplicable deference to Putin dating back years before his presidency. It runs through the MAGA movement's fundamental hostility to liberal democracy and its embrace of strongman politics. It runs through the right-wing media ecosystem that has spent years running interference for the Kremlin and laundering Russian propaganda, and a big MAGA conceit is the idea that a nefarious deep state network of senior federal bureaucrats, non-governmental experts, and technocratic and managerial elites lurks behind the push to fund Ukraine, and that it's making up lies about Russia's war to create a pretext to fulfill a broader set of sinister globalist aims. This conspiracy theory has become gospel in MAGA world, and it allows them to dismiss any inconvenient facts about Russian atrocities or Ukrainian courage as globalist propaganda, and once you have constructed that epistemic fortress, you can justify any betrayal, you can rationalize any abandonment, you can excuse any alignment with autocracy. But here is what should terrify you and keep you awake at night worrying about the future of the democratic world. This national security strategy marks an ideological and substantive shift in U.S. foreign policy, as the administration is attempting to define a new America First foreign policy doctrine that is deeply pragmatic and perhaps short-sighted. The democracy agenda is clearly over. Foreign policy choices will be made based on what makes the United States more powerful and prosperous, and today's self-interested choices may lead to a far lonelier, weaker, more fractured future. Translation: we are witnessing the end of America as the leader of the free world and its replacement with America as just another great power pursuing narrow interests without regard for the broader international order that has prevented great power war for 8 decades. And if you think that is hyperbole, if you think I am being alarmist, then you have not been paying attention to what this administration has actually done versus what it claims to believe. Senator Richard Blumenthal cast doubt on the Trump administration's talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin, expressing worry that U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner were on a fool's errand that is designed simply to give Putin more time to stonewall us. And that assessment looks more prescient with each passing week, because the negotiations keep dragging on with no real progress, while Russia continues its brutal assault on Ukrainian cities. Russian barrages of civilian areas of Ukraine continued overnight into Thursday, with a missile striking Kryvyi Rih on Wednesday night, wounding 6 people, including a 3-year-old girl, damaging more than 40 residential buildings, a school, and domestic gas pipes. This is what negotiations look like, when one side is negotiating in bad faith, and the other side is desperate for a deal, at almost any price, and Putin understands Trump's psychology perfectly. He knows that Trump wants a win, he wants to be the peacemaker, he wants the Nobel Prize, or at least the acclaim, and Putin is happy to string him along promising progress, while continuing to pound Ukraine into submission. The national security expert in that clip understands what many Americans still refuse to accept, which is that strategic clarity is entirely missing from the new NSS, which is more polemic than policy, the North Star of great power competition with China and Russia, around which the first Trump administration built bipartisan consensus is gone, and rather than describing the scope and scale of China's systemic challenge to the United States and our allies and partners, the 2025 NSS makes clear that economics are the ultimate stakes, and the new paramount objective of Washington's China policy is a mutually advantageous economic relationship with Beijing. So we have abandoned strategic competition with our genuine adversaries in favor of transactional relationships that prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term security interests. And if that sounds like a recipe for American decline and the erosion of the international order, that is because it is exactly that. Listen to how the progressive think tank Center for American Progress framed this disaster, because they got it exactly right. The Russian proposal speaks for itself, demanding that Ukraine surrender territory except limits on its armed forces and curb Western military assistance. It punishes the victim and shields the aggressor from any cost, a dynamic that leads to more instability, not peace. This is the fundamental moral and strategic error at the heart of Trump's approach to Ukraine. He treats the aggressor and the victim as if they have equal claims. He demands concessions from the democracy, while allowing the autocracy to keep its territorial gains and threatening further expansion, and this approach does not produce peace. It produces appeasement, and we know from history exactly where appeasement leads, when you are dealing with dictators who view compromise as weakness and concessions as invitations to further aggression. The casualties keep mounting while Trump plays peacemaker with a dictator who has no intention of making peace on any terms other than complete Ukrainian surrender. The number of civilian casualties for the first 10 months of 2025 has already exceeded the total for all of 2024, and in total there have been 53,006 civilian casualties, including 14,534 deaths since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. Every one of those deaths represents a human life destroyed by Russian aggression, a family torn apart by Putin's imperial ambitions, a future that will never be realized because an autocrat decided that Ukrainian sovereignty was less important than his vision of Russian greatness, and the Trump administration's response to this ongoing atrocity is to publish a national security strategy that treats European values as the problem, and to negotiate a peace plan that rewards Russian aggression with territorial gains. You want to understand how we got here? Then you need to examine the ideological transformation of the Republican Party over the past decade, because the rise of the MAGA right has prompted the Republican Party to reevaluate its foreign policy priorities, particularly concerning Ukraine, resulting in some Republicans in Congress, with a track record of supporting internationalism and democracy abroad, now finding themselves at odds with the increasing far-right inward-looking politics in their party. This once-in-a-generation realignment of the Republican Party is best embodied by former President Donald Trump, whose tenure was marked by an unorthodox approach to foreign policy, which often involved intimate interactions with autocratic leaders, including Russia's President Putin, and at best Trump and his congressional supporters have viewed alliance relationships and agreements as transactional. This transactional worldview is fundamentally incompatible with the kind of sustained commitment required to maintain a rules-based international order, because when everything is a transaction, when every alliance is conditional, when every treaty is renegotiable, then you have no principles, only interests, and when you have no principles, you can justify any betrayal, you can rationalize any abandonment, you can excuse any alignment with authoritarianism, as long as you think you are getting a good deal, and Trump thinks he is getting a good deal with Putin, because Trump has always admired strongmen, has always been drawn to autocratic power, has always viewed democratic norms and institutions as constraints on his own authority, rather than as essential guardrails that prevent the descent into tyranny. The expert in that clip nails it when he says that if you cannot even name your enemies, then your strategy will fail, and that is exactly what we are witnessing in real time, a national security strategy that cannot bring itself to identify Vladimir Putin and his unprovoked invasion as the core threat to European security, because doing so would require acknowledging that the Trump administration has aligned itself with the wrong side of this conflict, has chosen the autocrat over the Democrat, has decided that Putin's vision of a world where might makes right and borders can be redrawn by force is acceptable, as long as it allows Trump to claim credit for ending a war that he helped prolong through his ambivalence and his mixed signals and his willingness to echo Kremlin talking points. President Trump is falsely blaming Ukraine, a U.S. ally, for starting the war 3 years ago. Let that sink in for a moment because the implications are staggering. The President of the United States is repeating Russian propaganda verbatim, blaming the victim of aggression for the crime of being invaded. And this is not a gaffe, this is not a misstatement, this is the logical endpoint of an administration that has built its entire approach to this conflict on the foundation of moral equivalence between aggressor and victim, between autocracy and democracy, between imperialism and self-determination, and when you construct your foreign policy on such a rotten foundation, the structure that results can only be a betrayal of everything America has claimed to stand for in the world. The Center for Strategic and International Studies put it starkly when analyzing the implications of this strategic shift, and observers note this NSS is a real painful, shocking wake-up call for Europe, representing a moment of cavernous divergence between Europe's view of itself and Trump's vision for Europe, and if Europe had any doubt that the Trump administration is fully committed to a tough love strategy, it now knows for sure. Except this is not tough love. This is abandonment, dressed up in the language of realism. This is the United States telling its oldest and most reliable allies that their commitment to liberal democracy and human rights and the rule of law makes them weak rather than strong, that their openness to migration and their social safety nets and their multilateral institutions represent civilizational decline rather than civilizational achievement, and that if they want American support, they need to become more like Viktor Orban's Hungary or Marine Le Pen's France, authoritarian nationalists. Bar closed. This is the future that Trump and the MAGA right envision for the West, and it is a nightmare vision that would undo everything the Allied powers fought for in World War II, everything the United States built in the decades after that conflict, everything that has kept Europe peaceful, prosperous for longer than any period in its bloody history. And Putin understands this, which is why the Kremlin praised Trump's national security strategy, saying it aligns closely with Russia's own view of global affairs, because of course it does, because Trump's vision and Putin's vision are compatible in all the ways that matter. They both see liberal democracy as weak and declining. They both view strongman rule as effective and legitimate. They both believe that national sovereignty should be determined by power, rather than by the democratic choices of peoples. They both think that the post-World War II international order has outlived its usefulness and needs to be replaced by something more transactional, more nationalist, more willing to accept that some nations have spheres of influence and other nations exist within those spheres, with limited sovereignty and constrained choices. And here is the final devastating point that needs to be made and repeated and shouted from the rooftops until it penetrates the American consciousness. One point in the proposal demands that Russia enshrine in law its policy of non-aggression toward Ukraine and Europe, but that idea laughably treats Russian legislation as a meaningful constraint on Putin's ambitions when the Kremlin rewrites Russian law whenever strategy requires it, criminalizing anti-war speech, legitimizing occupation, redrawing borders and erasing Ukrainian identity, because law in Putin's Russia functions as an instrument of power, not a barrier to aggression. So when Trump and his MAGA allies tell you that this peace plan will prevent future conflict, when they promise you that Putin will respect Ukrainian sovereignty once he gets what he wants, when they assure you that Russian commitments enshrined in law will constrain Putin's imperial ambitions, they are either catastrophically ignorant of how autocratic regimes actually function, or they are lying to you, and I increasingly believe it is the latter, because the pattern is too consistent, the excuses too familiar, the deference too pronounced, and the alignment too perfect between what Putin wants and what Trump delivers. And if that makes you uncomfortable, if that challenges your understanding of American foreign policy, if that forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about who this administration serves and what worldview animates its understanding of the world, then good, because discomfort is the beginning of awareness, and awareness is the prerequisite for resistance, and resistance is the only thing that stands between us and the complete collapse of the democratic international order that has kept us safe and free and prosperous for 8 decades, and we are watching that order being dismantled piece by piece, document by document, concession by concession, while Ukraine bleeds and Putin smiles, and Europe watches in horror, wondering if America has finally and irrevocably turned its back on the values and principles and alliances that made us not just powerful, legitimate, not just strong, but not just victorious, but worthy of victory. And the answer to that question is being written right now in the halls of the White House, in the corridors of the Kremlin, in the trenches of eastern Ukraine, in the capitals of Europe, where our allies are learning the hard lesson that American commitments are only as reliable as the character of the American president, and this president has shown us exactly who he is and what he values, and it is not democracy, it is not freedom, it is not the rules-based international order, it is Putin's vision of a world where might makes right, where borders can be redrawn by force, where democracies can be invaded with impunity, and where America cheers from the sidelines as long as we can call it peace.